Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Zotac GTX 1080 Ti Mini. Why are we looking at this instead of something like a Hall of Fame, which I do incidentally have pictures for? Well, I find this thing really interesting because Zotac has gone, like, it's not every day that you see a GTX 1080 Ti this small, so big thanks to the guy who sent the pictures in, and I guess I should apologize for, what I'm about to say about this card, because there are compromises that had to be made to make a card this compact out of a 1080 Ti. So let's get right into it. Starting off with just highlighting all the different VRMs. The V-Core VRM is obviously this thing right here, since it is the largest VRM on the card. So that's V-Core, and apparently I've set my brush size too low, so let's fix that. That there is V-Core. That's not a C. That is the memory VRM. Kind of an interesting layout. But I don't think it's the first time I've seen something like this on a 1080 Ti. So, well, VM. So that supplies 1.35 volts to all of the GDDR5X chips around the card. Then there's this right here, which I suspect is a 1.8 volt rail for the, 1.8 volts VPP for the GDDR5X chips again. It could also be 1.8 volts for the BIOS system, or it could be 1.8 volts for both of them at the same time. I'm not entirely sure. I've not worked with any 1080 Ti's, so I'm at all. So I have no idea, and I'm just going off of a picture here. If I had the card in hand, I could definitely, I could figure it out, but with pictures, not happening. But that is going to be some kind of supporting voltage that you don't really have to worry about when overclocking. It's just kind of worth pointing out that it exists. And then down here we have the 1 volt PLL or PEX VRM, whichever you prefer to call it. This powers the PCIe interface on the card, as well as some internal PLLs. So yeah, and this one is also completely irrelevant to overclocking until you put the card on a 1080 Ti on liquid nitrogen. Though if you were going to choose a 1080 Ti to put on liquid nitrogen, this one would probably be your no. The only way I'd choose this one was if it was the only option available. Because it's this right here is a problem for LN2 pot mounting, and then there's a whole bunch of other things that Zotac has done that make this card, well, the other compromises that Zotac has made. So let's get into those, since they all revolve around the V-Core VRM, and now we're going to start talking about it. So the first big compromise here is a significant lack of any input filtering for the two 8-pins. There are 0 input filtering chokes for these two 8-pins up here. And that can cause some issues. Especially if you have a power supply that is very borderline capable of running, borderline being capable of running your system. The lack of input filtering chokes basically means that any big current spikes that the GPU core produces while running, which is normal. GPUs don't have a constant load cycle. They go, they don't flatline at 300 watts. They a lot of GPUs, they'll go up to say 400 or even 500, and then they'll dive right after that, they'll dive down to 10 watts, and they'll swing up and down in terms of power consumption very, very heavily. And basically, most 1080 Ti's will have input filtering chokes that will basically prevent any of those current spikes caused by the big fluctuations in power draw from getting to your power supply. The reason why this could be a problem on power supplies that are just borderline of being capable of running your system is that without those input filtering chokes, a lot of those current spikes will just go straight all the way to your power supply, and there's a pretty good chance that it would trip over current protection, which basically your system would just shut down out of nowhere while playing a game or something. So that's not very pleasant if you run into that. So I really wouldn't advise, I'm not sure, I don't think the card would do it on the stock power limit, But yeah, I really wouldn't recommend. Like, I know it's a mini ITX card, so you're kind of like, it's hard finding large PSUs in in small form factors, but I would avoid putting this on a PSU that is very, very close to maxed out with the rest of the parts that you add to the system, because this doesn't have input filtering at all, and there's a pretty good chance the PSU would get upset over that. It wouldn't actually harm the PSU, you'd just trip the protection system, which is really in place to prevent you from pulling very large currents for extended periods of time, but if, you get repeated current spikes, you might end up tripping it. So that's one concern I'd have with the card, but that probably won't be too big an issue. And then moving on to the other complaint I have for this thing is the bypass capacitors, and there's like not enough of them in my opinion. And this is actually this is something you'd actually need to test, but just going off of the photos of this card just going off of the photos I've seen of this card, your main V-core capacitor bank is basically these 8 aluminum polymers right here, and I assume they're polymers, they're probably not electrolytics. I'm not sure who makes them, don't know what the spec on them is, but that's basically, and these multi-layer ceramics, those are all the capacitors that are right on the VRM. That's it. There's no more bypass anywhere near no more decoupling for the VRM, and there's no bypass anywhere near that area. The rest of the capacitors on this card are all just for V-core. I think maybe these might be, but there's also a pretty good chance these are all memory power, just because they're really close to the memory chips, and I'm not sure what kind of mounting hardware the card has. If I had the card in hand, I could check, but with just pictures, I'm really not sure what these bypass capacitors are for. I'm hoping they're for the core, because, as I said, there's no extra filtering capacitors here, and then you do get this, but this is standard for a 1080 Ti. Every single 1080 Ti ever has, not necessarily the 4 large polymers we see here, but they definitely have all the little ceramics right behind the core, because those are necessary for the cards to run. So there's a pretty good chance that this card will clock on average worse than any other 1080 Ti, just because there's not a lot of output filtering capacitors on the V-core. So yeah, that's another issue I see with the card. But ultimately, if you're not overclocking, which I guess in an ITX system you're probably, if you're building an ITX rig, you might overclock, but you won't be going for blowing out the power limit and that kind of thing. You won't be going absolutely insane on the card. So I guess it's okay that, the capacitor bank might cost you, say, 10, 30 megahertz core clock, which is actually realistic. And I've, and there's nothing, I can't complain to Zotac about this. There's not really much they could have done. I do think they could have maybe tried cram some multi-layer ceramics right behind the V-core VRM as well. But beyond that, there's really not much they could do about this, because the card, there's no space here. They don't even have space to put input filtering chokes, much less build a bigger capacitor bank. So yeah, it might cost you a few megahertz on the core clock on core clock when overclocking, but other than that, it shouldn't be, it shouldn't be a huge issue. And this is actually an issue that also came up, I was basically talking to MLLR, KLLR from overclock.net about sort of capacitor modding, and he's done way more volt modding and capacitor modding on cards than I've ever done. And he said that the card where he saw the biggest gain from a capacitor mod was a GTX 1060 Mini from Zotac, because again, it was just the card is so space constrained that you don't really get enough space for a big, proper, varied, because the other thing is, it's not just about having a lot of capacitance, it's about having a lot of different types of capacitors and then having lots of them in parallel, and all of those things basically are just they just eat board space. So the Mini, he told me, picked up, I think it was more than 10 megahertz, which is a lot for a capacitor mod on a modern card. On like the 500, like on old Nvidia cards, that would have been pretty normal, but on modern Nvidia cards, that's actually like a lot, because for example, my 1070 literally doesn't care what you add, what kinds of capacitors you add to it, it still clocks the same, and I've tested that myself. But yeah, this thing could potentially, like, if you cap modded this, you could potentially see some pretty good gains on overclocking. On the other hand, this is an ITX card, so I see no reason why you would even consider doing that. Unless, well, I actually do have an idea, but that's mostly because I have an idea for a crazy ITX build one day, but even then, I think I just try to find a case that can accommodate a bigger card, rather than this. Because if you're really space constrained, then yeah, this is probably the card you'll go for, and, you know, losing a couple tens of megahertz on core clock probably isn't the worst sacrifice you've made. So, yeah. Now then, let's finally get onto the power capabilities on the VRM that we've talked about, sort of the big compromises that Zotac has made here. The V-Core VRM is not spectacular, even though it is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 phase design, powered by this chip right here, well, controlled by that chip right here, not powered, but that is a UP9511, so the standard voltage controller for all NVIDIA, for most high-end 10 series NVIDIA cards. This thing is a 8-phase voltage controller, so there's no doubling on this card, so that's cool. It is a true 8-phase at the very least. And it goes up to 600 kilohertz switching frequency, but because most MOSFETs are designed and optimized to run at around 300 kilohertz, and most VRMs run at around 300 kilohertz, I'm doing all of my ratings for this VRM at 1.09 volts output voltage, because that's where the NVIDIA draws the line for you, and 300 kilohertz, because that's where the VRM is probably running. So for these, for this voltage and this switching frequency, this VRM should deliver 200 amps while producing about 35 watts of heat, which is quite frankly terrible by 1080 Ti standards. Like, there are cards that can do 200 amps at like 20 watts of heat output. So this VRM is not particularly efficient, and the main reason for that is these chips right here are Ubic Semiconductor QM3816N dual NFETs. So there's a high side MOSFET and a low side MOSFET built into one of these chips. And the problem with these is they're pretty slow to... The high side MOSFET is really slow compared to what I've seen on a lot of other cards. And the low side MOSFET is also pretty slow. And, well, actually, that's probably the slowest low side MOSFET I've ever seen. And the other issue is it's also not super low RDS on. So with 16 of these chips in the VRM, yeah, it's going to run pretty hot. 200 amps, 35 watts. If you go all the way up to 250 amps, so 200 amps, you can actually hit that. Like, the card might even do that on stock settings. 250 amps, you're going to be looking at about 45 watts of heat, which is like a lot, but you'll need to, like, this would need a raised power limit. Definitely you need to overclock to hit that. And that's a lot of heat. And then 300 amps, which you'd probably need like a power lifted BIOS or physical modifications to the card to get all the way to this level of current draw. At that point, the VRM will put out 60 watts of heat, at which point I'm going to say that this being a long strip with, you know, it doesn't have a lot of surface area, it's crammed onto the edge of the PCB, it's in a mini ITX card, it's just like, it's going to run super hot if it doesn't completely blow up. Luckily, it'll still be able to deliver all of these power, like, current levels. Like, yeah, it can do all of that at up to 125 degrees centigrade. It can even go well beyond that, but it's just like, I'm not going to go into those ratings because they're just not practical, because we're already doing 60 watts of heat output at 300 amps. So this VRM, you know, again, for an ITX card, actually no. They could have totally gotten better MOSFETs. There are better dual NFETs out there that fit into this same package that just cost a lot more money than what we see here. MSI uses these 3816s on, I do believe they use it on the RX 480 Gaming X. They use these MOSFETs. Because I've seen these used elsewhere, and they also use these for memory power on the Lightning. Let's just put it this way. If you're using a MOSFET, if some card's using your MOSFET for memory power, your MOSFET's not big enough. that's your MOSFET's not good enough because for VCore. Because, yeah. So, not great. Really, really not great. It's going to run hot. It's not going to be super efficient, but yeah. It's ITX, you know, but still, they could have gotten better MOSFETs there. So I'm not impressed by the VCore VRM. It's not like it's going to blow up. Ultimately, I think you're not going to be able to cool the core before you run into a VRM issue. But yeah, it's not great. So let's move on to the memory VRM, which is using the same QM3816. So it uses those same MOSFETs. And the end result is that this memory VRM could put out about, like, say 30 amps at 1.35 volts with just producing 6 watts of heat. So that's actually really okay. And actually, memory shouldn't even pull as much as 30 amps. It really won't get that hot. So the memory VRM, that's perfectly fine. The VCore VRM, between the lack of input filtering chokes, the lack of, like, the significant, very small amount of filtering capacitors on the output, and then the fact that the MOSFETs aren't great, I'm really not impressed. Like, you know, but considering that this is the only 1080 Ti ITX card I'm aware of, you don't really have a choice if you want to build an ITX system, and you're kind of stuck with this. So yeah, that's not great. I'm like, yeah, it's really not, it's not a very impressive card. For those of you who are interested in, you know, like really hammering the card and like blowing it up all the way, then your current shunts for lifting the power limit are here, here, and here. If you would like to do the more complicated power mod that like I did, your INA3221 chip is that thing right there. These are probably the, what is it, smoothing? Well, basically these capacitors are hooked up in parallel to these shunts so that they slow down the voltage drop transition across the shunts. There's also some resistors. So if you want to mod the card, so basically your options are liquid metal across the shunts to reduce the shunt resistance, or another option is to put a resistor across these capacitors right here, and that would also raise your power limit. Though, considering that this VRM is kind of garbage, I really recommend not doing that, because, yeah, it's really just, you know, I get that it's size limited, but there are better dual NFETs out there, like, say, the ones found on the Founders Edition, in fact. The Founders Edition uses perfectly good MOSFETs. I have no idea why Zotac decided to downgrade to UBIC QM3816s. Because the Fairchild, whatever the Fairchild MOSFETs on the Founders Edition are, those are just fine. And those would have fit in the same package, because I'm 99% sure they are the same package. So if you were really handy with like an SMD desolder, like an SMD rework station, I guess you could replace all the MOSFETs on the VRM to get, you know, a better, more efficient VRM on the card. Though I don't really know why you'd want to do that. I guess if you're really desperate for an ITX system, maybe, but yeah. Well, you know, at least it's small. That's really the only impressive thing about the card, because the VCore VRM is just horrifically, in my opinion, compromised by pretty much everything. And then the memory VRM, I mean, the memory VRM is not a problem, but the memory VRM is never a problem. So, I don't see why you'd celebrate that. And then, you know, there's the two minor VRMs, which we don't really need to care about. So, yeah, that's it for this PCB breakdown. I mean, it's the only ITX card you have. You don't really have a choice, so at least Zotac doesn't have competition here, but it's, you know, it's not very good. It's not like it's going to be a disaster. It's not going to burn your house down. It's just not very good. You know, it could be a lot better. And probably cost a lot more. But, so that's it for this video. Thank you for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment down below, or any questions you may have, or anything like that. There's a comment section down below. You can use that for that. I also have a Patreon, PayPal, there's shirts, there's all kinds of things that you can basically, you know, use to support what I do here at actually hardcore overclocking. So if you want to see more content and more regular content, you can go and like support me through those. And that's it for this video. I don't think I've forgotten anything at this point, have I? Because I've kind of not done a proper video in a while, so I forgot how I did the outros. So yeah, that's it, and thank you for watching. See you next time.